The first thing anyone remembered was the sound, the hiss and crack of electricity ripping through the noise of the Saturday farmers market. Miriam Stroud didn't even scream. 1 second, she stood with her paper cup of coffee, receipt still fluttering in her hand. The next, her body convulsed and collapsed onto the cobblestones. The cup burst apart, hot liquid staining her blouse and seeping into the cracks of the street. People scattered, produce baskets tipped. Apples rolled across the ground. The officers moved fast, forming a half circle, weapons up. Their black armor gleamed against the sunlight, faces hidden behind tinted visors. One barked, "Don't move, ma'am," but it was already too late. Miriam twitched, gasping, her eyes wide in mute disbelief. And then they turned on him, hands where I can see them. Step back. Caleb Stroud, 73 years old, thin shoulders stooped beneath a worn jacket, did not flinch. He raised his hands slowly, palms outward, as though every second were measured. His eyes gray, steady, unblinking, locked onto the man in charge. "She's my wife," he said calmly. "She was buying coffee." The commander didn't listen. His voice cracked with adrenaline. "Back up, old man. You're next." Something inside the crowd shifted. Some clutched phones, recording. Others shielded their children. The tension was unbearable because Caleb didn't move. Not until he spoke 5 words. "Call Director Harlow right now." The silence that followed was instant, brutal. The squad leader stiffened, a muscle ticking in his jaw. One of the younger officers blinked, glanced sideways, unsure. The radios clipped to their vests, crackled faintly, but no one moved. 5 words. That was all it took. The commander's tone faltered, softer now, almost disbelieving. "What did you just say?" Caleb's hand stayed raised. His voice didn't rise, didn't quiver. "You heard me. Call Director Harlow right now." It was like a spell had been cast. The officers didn't lower their weapons, but they didn't advance either. The medic, who should have been rushing to Miriam, hesitated, caught between orders and something larger. Even the children had stopped crying. Because no ordinary man spoke like that. No ordinary man stopped a trained, tactical team in their tracks with nothing but words. Someone muttered under their breath, "Who the hell is this guy?" Caleb ignored them. His gaze didn't shift from the commander. He seemed detached, as though he'd walked this road before, in another country, another decade. "Wrong address," he said evenly. "Wrong target. You made a mistake." The commander snapped back to life, covering his uncertainty with volume. "Shut him down. Restrain him." 2 officers moved forward, shoving Caleb hard against the hood of a nearby cruiser. His chest hit metal warmed by the morning Sunday. His wrists were yanked behind him, zip ties cinched cruelly tight. Through it all, he didn't fight. Didn't resist. Didn't even raise his voice. "My wife has a heart condition," he said quietly. "She needs medical attention." No one responded. From the corner of his vision, he saw Miriam still on the ground, her hand trembling as she tried to push herself upright. The taser barbs glinted near her collarbone. Her glasses had skidded beneath a vendor's stall. She looked lost, gasping, as though trying to anchor herself to reality. Caleb closed his eyes briefly. He remembered the hospital 20 years earlier, the night her heart almost gave out. He remembered promising her, promising that he was done with all of it. No more shadow wars, no more violence, no more whispered names in the dark. But promises had a way of breaking when the past came calling. He opened his eyes again. They were clear, focused. He spoke not to the officers, but directly to the commander. "Check your coordinates," he said. "This isn't the location you were sent to. You're supposed to be at 814 Riverside Avenue. You're standing on Grove Street. Wrong block, wrong suspect." The commander froze. His jaw slackened, his eyes narrowing. How could a retired mechanic from Asheville know their dispatch orders better than they did? One of the younger officers paled visibly, glancing at his tablet. His thumbs shook as he typed in confirmation codes. A long pause, and then he whispered to the commander, voice trembling, "He's right, sir." The crowd stirred, confusion rippled through the team. And then Caleb spoke again, his voice quiet, steady, and absolute. "Left pocket. Inside lining. Look. Don't touch." The commander hesitated, then jerked his chin. One of the older officers stepped forward warily, gloved hands searching exactly where Caleb had directed. His fingers brushed metal. He pulled out a badge. Black, worn, heavy. Not police, not military, something older, deeper. Its engraving was faint, dulled by time, but unmistakable to anyone who had spent years in the shadows. The officer's eyes widened. His lips parted. He showed it to the commander without a word. The entire scene shifted. The weapons didn't lower, but no one shouted anymore. Radios fell silent. Even the birds circling overhead seemed to pause. The commander's voice broke. "What is this?" Caleb finally turned his head, his face calm, impassive. "That," he said, "is Obsidian protocol clearance." A whisper tore through the team like a current. Obsidian protocol. Most of them had never heard it, but the older ones had, and those men looked shaken. The commander swallowed hard, sweat sliding along his temple. "Who are you?" he demanded. Caleb Stroud's answer was just as calm as before. "Someone who built the system you're misusing." The crowd gasped. The market stalls stood frozen in half-abandoned disarray. The officers didn't move. Miriam, still trembling on the pavement, turned her head just enough to see him. And for the first time in decades, she was afraid not of the men with guns, not of the taser still lodged in her skin, but of what her husband might truly be. The farmer's market never looked the same after that day. For years, it had been a place of color and simplicity, rows of jam jars, quilts hung from wire frames, the smell of fried dough drifting with laughter and dogs tugging on leashes. Caleb and Miriam had walked those cobblestones countless Saturdays, buying nothing more complicated than apples, honey, or coffee. But after the taser crackled and Miriam's body crumpled in the middle of the square, the air around Grove Street carried something different. A weight, a memory. People slowed when they walked past. Some still pointed at the wall where coffee had stained the brick, even weeks later. Caleb didn't notice. Or maybe he noticed and didn't let it show. He still carried the same cloth bag to the market each Saturday, still helped vendors lift crates or repair a loose canopy pole, still bought Miriam her cinnamon coffee, though now she sometimes stared at the cup longer than she drank it. But behind the quiet routine, the town began to whisper. Caleb Stroud lived in a weathered two-story house on the edge of Asheville. The shingles curled like brittle paper, and the porch railing sagged where years of rain had gnawed at it. A dusty Ford truck sat in the drive, dented and paint faded, but its engine purred smoother than any new vehicle in the county. Caleb had rebuilt it twice, by hand, in the silence of his garage. At 73, his back hunched slightly, but his hands remained steady. Neighbors brought him broken lawnmowers, bent bicycles, radios that had long stopped singing. He fixed them all with the same calm, methodical rhythm, never asking for payment, never explaining how he always seemed to know which hidden gear or wire was wrong before even opening the machine. People respected him, but they never really knew him. To them, Caleb was the quiet widower who had remarried late in life, who kept his lawn trimmed and his porch swept. They didn't know about the decades before Asheville, before Miriam, before the promise of anonymity. Miriam knew. She had always known. She remembered the night he told her, 15 years earlier. They had been sitting on the back porch after a storm. The air smelled of wet pine, and lightning bugs stitched yellow trails in the dark. "You deserve truth," he had said simply, his voice so calm she almost missed the gravity of his words. Then he told her, not everything, not names or details, but enough. Enough to understand why he woke gasping some nights, drenched in sweat, why he sometimes scanned every doorway in a restaurant before sitting down, why certain dates on the calendar made him restless, pacing. He told her about his time in the service, not the Army, not the Navy, not anything the average man could list on a form. Something nameless, buried between lines of classified doctrine. Missions that never appeared in newspapers. Operations that officially never existed. The hardest part for her to believe was not the danger, not the violence, but the silence. "All that time," Miriam whispered that night, "and you never told anyone?" Caleb had looked at her then, his eyes the same steel gray they were at the farmer's market weeks ago. "No one else could ever know," he said. "And now you do. That makes you my last anchor." She had never asked again. In Asheville, his life became rhythm, not drama. Every Monday, he delivered food to the veterans' shelter. He didn't stay to chat, just replaced broken hinges, repaired rusted wheelchairs, tuned the shelter's rattling generator. Every Wednesday, he drove to the high school, sitting in the auto shop class for 2 hours. He rarely spoke, just watched, occasionally handing a student the right wrench at the right moment. Every evening, without fail, he brought Miriam a coffee from the corner diner, sometimes with pie, always with the same soft, "Here you go," that carried more weight than words could measure. That Tuesday morning had started no differently. Caleb had just finished replacing a radiator for Mrs. Goodwin across the street. His hands smelled of oil, and the red rag in his pocket was already stained from years of use. Miriam had kissed him on the cheek and said, "Senior discount day, I'll grab coffee before the line grows." She walked toward Grove Street with the same casual pace she always had. The leaves had only begun to turn. A breeze stirred the flags along the post office. Caleb folded the rag neatly in his pocket, a man of small rituals, and then he heard it, the growl of tires taken too hard around a corner. Not the kind of sound that came from teenagers showing off. Something else. Something wrong. When he looked up and saw the dark SUVs ignoring stop signs, he felt the old weight settle on his chest. Later, after the market chaos and after the words that froze an entire tactical team in place, the neighbors whispered more boldly. "Did you see how he spoke?" one asked at the diner. "He didn't shout. He didn't even argue. Just commanded," said another. "Director Harlow," murmured a third, rolling the name like a stone in his mouth. Who the hell is Director Harlow? Rumors bloomed like mold in damp corners. Some said Caleb had once been CIA. Others swore he was ex-Delta, though no one could recall seeing his name on any wall at the VFW. A few older veterans shook their heads quietly. "Not Delta," one muttered. "Something else. Something that doesn't have initials you can say out loud." And Miriam, hearing all of it, carried the heaviest silence of them all. One evening, a week after the incident, she stood by the kitchen sink washing a chipped mug. Caleb sat at the table, oil-stained fingers tinkering with the gears of an old clock. "You promised," she said suddenly. Caleb didn't look up. "I did. You said it was finished. That you left it behind." His hand slowed, but the gears still turned in his palm. "I tried." She set the mug down hard enough to make it crack against the porcelain sink. "They tased me, Caleb. I thought I was dying. And you," her voice broke, "you became someone else, someone I don't recognize." Only then did he raise his eyes, meeting hers. "I became who I always was," he said softly. "You just hadn't seen him yet." The silence that followed was heavier than any shouting. And in that silence, one truth crystallized. The past Caleb Stroud had buried wasn't finished. It was waiting. And after Grove Street, it had found him again. The badge glinted black in the sunlight, heavy as iron and older than most of the men holding rifles around him. The officer who'd pulled it from Caleb's jacket lining held it carefully, almost reverently, as though it might burn his fingers if he gripped too hard. His lips moved silently as he read the faded inscription. Then his eyes flicked upward toward the commander, toward Caleb, toward the trembling line between fear and recognition. This isn't military," the officer said finally. His voice cracked in the hushed air. "This is," he stopped, shook his head as if he couldn't finish the thought. "Obsidian protocol clearance," Caleb repeated calmly. The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. Every ripple widened. One of the younger officers, helmet slightly askew, turned pale beneath the visor. "That's impossible. Obsidian protocol was decommissioned. 40 years ago. It was never decommissioned," Caleb interrupted. His voice didn't rise, but it cut through the tension sharper than any blade. "It was buried. That's different." The commander's face hardened, but the sweat along his jaw betrayed him. He took a step forward, lowering his voice to something almost human. "Who the hell are you?" Caleb's wrists were still bound by plastic ties. His shoulders slumped with age. His jacket smelled faintly of motor oil and pine. But his eyes, those unflinching storm gray eyes, met the commander's and did not waver. "I'm someone who wrote the very doctrine you're misusing right now," he said. "I built the system that keeps you from firing without cause, from tasing civilians at wrong addresses. You broke those rules, and you don't even realize who you're breaking them in front of." A murmur tore through the team. "Go stops," someone whispered. I thought those were myths, another muttered. Not myths, said the older officer who still held the badge. His voice had a weight to it. Legends. On the ground, Miriam stirred weakly, her fingers clawing at the cobblestones as if anchoring herself to the world. Caleb's head turned instinctively. She needs medical attention now, he said. The calmness of his tone made it sound less like a request and more like a command. The commander hesitated. His training screamed to maintain control, but his instincts whispered something else, that this frail-looking man bound in zip ties wasn't a suspect. He was something much more dangerous. Medic, the commander said finally. It was a single word, but it shifted the air. A man in gloves hurried forward with a trauma kit. He knelt beside Miriam, cutting the taser wires, checking her pulse. Caleb exhaled slowly, but then, the younger officer who had fired the taser barked out, defensive, panicked. She ignored orders! She was reaching! For a receipt, Caleb snapped, his voice cracking like thunder for the first time. Every head turned. For a slip of paper in her hand. You saw a threat where there was none, and you fired. The officer stepped back, shame fighting with stubbornness. His fingers twitched at the strap of his vest, but he said nothing more. The commander's radio crackled. A voice on the other end barked rapid updates, coded language, coordinates. The commander raised it to his mouth, but before he could speak, Caleb spoke again. Check your dispatch logs. You weren't sent here. You were sent to Riverside Avenue, a warehouse, 2 miles east. This is Grove Street. You've trapped the wrong people. The younger officer fumbled with his tablet again, swiping furiously. His breath caught. Sir, he's right. The call came from 814 Riverside. We're standing at 814 Grove. The silence deepened. One by one, rifles dipped, not lowered fully, but angled just enough to reveal hesitation. The crowd watching from sidewalks leaned forward. Someone whispered, he knew their orders better than they did. Then came the final cut. Caleb's voice softened. You've already made one mistake that could have killed her. He tilted his head toward Miriam, now gasping under the medic's hands. Do you want the second mistake to be ignoring me again? The commander stared at him, caught between rage and awe. Then, slowly, he lifted a hand. Cut him loose, he ordered. A blade sliced through the zip ties. Caleb's wrist came free. He didn't rub them. He didn't move at all at first, just stood there with the quiet authority of someone who no longer needed restraints to command a room. The badge was handed back to him. He tucked it neatly into his pocket. And for the first time, he addressed the entire team, not just their leader. I walked away from Obsidian Protocol 30 years ago, but I never stopped watching. And I promise you this. When the man who built the system tells you you're on the wrong street, you listen. The medic looked up from Miriam, voice quick, urgent. Pulse is weak but steady. No cardiac event. She's in shock. Caleb finally moved, crossing to her side. He knelt, pressed 2 fingers gently against her neck, his lips close to her ear. I've got you, Miri. You're all right. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused, but she clutched his sleeve with surprising strength. The commander opened his mouth to retort, but before he could, the low growl of an approaching engine silenced everyone. From the far end of Grove Street, a charcoal gray SUV rolled into view. No sirens, no lights, just presence. It parked behind the SWAT vehicles. The man who emerged didn't wear a uniform, but the way the officer stiffened proved he didn't need one. Silver hair cropped short, eyes like sharpened glass, posture straight despite age. He walked directly toward Caleb, ignoring the commander entirely. And when the 2 men locked eyes, the entire square seemed to exhale. Stroud, the newcomer said quietly, with the familiarity of someone who'd expected this moment for decades. Caleb rose slowly to his feet, meeting him eye to eye. Harlow, he said, and then, to the shock of every officer on the block, Director Jonathan Harlow of the United States Strategic Intelligence Bureau, an agency most of them didn't even know existed, raised his hand and gave Caleb Stroud a full, formal salute. The square went silent when Director Harlow saluted. Every rifle dipped lower, though not one fully dropped. Officers shifted in their boots, glances darting like nervous birds. The commander's jaw worked, but no sound escaped. To see the man they took for a fragile old mechanic acknowledged like that, acknowledged by him, was to watch the ground tilt beneath their feet. Caleb returned the salute slowly, with a stiffness that came not from disrespect but from years of disuse. The gesture carried weight, heavier than the badge in his pocket, heavier than the rifles aimed at his chest. Harlow dropped his hand and turned his head, scanning the armored line. His voice cut across the market like steel against stone. "Which of you ordered a taser on an unarmed civilian?" The younger officer who had fired it twitched, sweat streaking down his jaw. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The silence condemned him louder than any admission. Harlow's eyes sharpened. Vest, badge, sidearm, now. The officer's lips parted as if to argue, but one look from Harlow killed the words in his throat. His trembling hands unclipped the vest. Holster, badge. Each item landed with a metallic thud on the hood of a squad car. When he was done, he stood there in his undershirt, pale and hollow-eyed, stripped of authority. "Sit," Harlow commanded. The officer obeyed, lowering himself to the curb like a schoolboy awaiting punishment. The crowd murmured, phones capturing every second. Somewhere, a child whispered, "He made the police sit down." Miriam coughed, the medic's hands steadying her shoulders. She looked up at Caleb, her lips trembling as words fought to rise. "You promised," she whispered hoarsely. Caleb's face softened, but he didn't answer. Not yet. The commander, red-faced and sweating, finally found his voice. "Sir, we acted under the belief this was a narcotics operation. High risk. We were told—" "You were told wrong," Harlow snapped, cutting him off with the precision of a blade. "And instead of verifying coordinates, you charged into the wrong street and assaulted civilians. Do you know who this man is?" His hand gestured toward Caleb without turning. The commander's mouth opened, closed. "Ellis Monroe?" one officer guessed uncertainly. "No," Harlow said flatly. "Worse for you. Better for the rest of us." He faced the team fully now, his words sharp and cold. "This is Caleb Stroud, the last surviving architect of Obsidian Protocol." The name washed over them like cold water. Several shifted uneasily. A few older ones actually took a step back. One whispered, "That was supposed to be shut down after Iron Winter." At the mention of those two words, Caleb's eyes flicked upward briefly, then settled again on Miriam. His hand brushed hers lightly, reassuring, though the weight of the past pressed heavy. Harlow's voice didn't waver. Iron Winter wasn't shut down, it was buried, and Stroud was the one who carried its weight long after the rest of us walked away. The crowd outside the cordon leaned forward, some gasping, others whispering. Few of them understood what those words meant, but the officers did. Iron Winter. Even if the details were classified, the rumors of it had survived whispers of a mission that tipped the balance of the Cold War. Whispers of betrayal. Whispers of blood, frozen beneath eastern snows. And now, that man stood in their small mountain town, zip ties broken, his wife trembling at his side. Miriam clutched Caleb's sleeve, her voice sharper this time. "You told me you left it. You told me it was finished." He looked down at her, eyes steady, voice so quiet only she could hear. "I tried, Mary. I swear I tried." Her lips pressed into a thin line, tears pooling but refusing to fall. For years she had accepted the silence, the nights when he woke shaking, the scars he never explained. But now the truth was spilling out under the sun, in front of cameras and rifles, and the man she loved was no longer just her husband. He was something bigger, older, more dangerous. The commander stammered, desperate to reclaim control. "Sir, with respect, we believed intelligence indicated—" Harlow rounded on him. "You believed without checking. You acted without thinking. And you nearly killed this woman because you mistook fear for facts." He stepped closer, his voice low and venomous. "This man wrote the very emergency doctrine your unit swears to follow. And you broke every line of it in one morning." The commander swallowed hard, looking suddenly very small despite the bulk of his armor. Caleb finally stood, guiding Miriam gently to her feet. His hands trembled slightly, not with fear, but with age and weight. "She needs rest," he said simply. "This circus is over." The crowd parted as he walked her toward a bench under the awning of the market wall. Every step was measured, every movement deliberate. The medic trailed close, clutching his kit, but it was Caleb who supported her most. When she sat, wrapping the blanket tighter around her shoulders, Caleb finally looked back at Harlow. "Why are you here?" he asked. Harlow's lips curled in something between a smile and a grimace. "Because the moment your name hit my radio, Stroud, I knew a dozen governments would notice, and I had to get here before they did." The commander blinked. "Governments?" Harlow ignored him. He reached into his coat, pulling out a sealed envelope. He placed it carefully on the bench beside Caleb. "This is two things," he said. "A formal written apology from the agency, and a reinstatement of your clearance. Obsidian wants you back." Miriam stiffened beside him, her fingers clutching his hand like iron. Caleb didn't even glance at the envelope. His voice was soft, almost weary. "My clearance belongs to her now." Harlow's jaw tightened, but he nodded slowly. "The offer stands." The weight of his words hung in the air. The crowd was restless now, a murmur spreading as neighbors with phones whispered, "He's not just a mechanic, he's something else. Something bigger." And behind the officers' visors, more than one pair of eyes stared at Caleb with a mix of fear, awe, and most dangerously curiosity. Because Obsidian Protocol wasn't just a ghost from the past, it was a secret that still carried power. And Caleb Stroud, whether he wanted it or not, had just been pulled back into its orbit. Snow fell in heavy sheets, swallowing sound and swallowing men. The year was 1987, the heart of winter in Eastern Europe, where the Cold War's shadow grew thickest. The world above the surface saw politics, speeches, treaties, but beneath that ice, beneath the frozen rivers and collapsing factories, other wars raged. Silent wars. Wars fought not with armies, but with ghosts. Caleb Stroud was one of those ghosts. The mission had been codenamed Iron Winter. Its details were locked behind so many layers of clearance that only a handful of men in Washington even knew it existed. On paper, the team didn't exist. The orders didn't exist. The target didn't exist. But the threat was real. An experimental warhead, small enough to move in a single truck, had been smuggled across borders by a splinter faction within the collapsing Eastern Bloc. It wasn't nuclear, at least not in the traditional sense. Its payload was worse, an engineered nerve compound capable of erasing a city block in minutes, undetectable until it was too late. The mission was simple on paper: infiltrate, intercept, erase. But missions on paper never matched the chaos in the snow. Caleb remembered the crunch of his boots on ice that night, how every step echoed too loudly in his own skull. He remembered the biting wind, how it clawed at the edges of his mask, how it seemed to whisper treachery in every gust. His Unit 5 men, all nameless outside the field, moved through the ruins of an abandoned textile factory on the outskirts of Krakow. They carried suppressed rifles, radios that whispered in code, eyes trained on every shadow. The warhead was supposed to be stored in a truck inside the factory. What they found instead were children. Dozens of them, thin, wide-eyed, herded into the same warehouse where the compound was being prepped for transport. Hostages, bargaining chips, shields. The youngest couldn't have been older than 7. Their breaths fogged in the freezing air, their lips blue. Caleb's gut turned to iron. The orders had been clear: destroy the payload, leave nothing standing. But standing in that factory, orders meant nothing. Because one choice was written in the mission: save the city or save the children. Not both. The commander of the team hissed into the radio, "We detonate and run. Collateral is collateral." Caleb turned his head slowly, his voice steady, quiet, dangerous. "You set that charge with them inside, and you're no better than the bastards who built this weapon." The commander's jaw tightened. Orders are orders. Caleb's hand tightened on his rifle. Orders end where humanity begins. For a moment, silence hung heavier than the falling snow. The men in the shadows looked back and forth between them, torn. Then Caleb made the call that would haunt him for decades. "Secure the children. I'll handle the payload." It happened fast. Too fast. Caleb moved deeper into the factory, toward the truck where the warhead sat encased in steel. The air stank of chemicals, acrid and sharp. 2 armed guards patrolled, but Caleb slipped through them like a shadow, knife flashing, silent and final. He reached the truck. His gloved fingers brushed the cold steel casing. The device hummed faintly alive, waiting. And he realized something the intelligence brief had missed. There was no timer, no detonation code. The warhead was rigged to a dead man's switch. If the man carrying it died, the compound would release. And that man was standing just beyond the truck. A gaunt figure in a thick coat, clutching a transmitter, eyes hollow but resolute. Caleb raised his rifle, but the man smiled thinly. "Kill me, and they die." Behind him, Caleb could hear the children whimpering as his team tried to shepherd them out. He could hear the commander cursing him, screaming that he was disobeying orders. He had seconds. Caleb did what no manual could have prepared him for. He didn't shoot. He didn't lunge. He didn't even raise his voice. He spoke. "You don't want to die here," Caleb said evenly. "Not in this snow, not as a footnote. They'll forget you. Your name, your cause, everything. You'll be nothing but ice on a factory floor." The man's grip on the switch tightened. "I'm already forgotten." "Then why are you still holding it?" Caleb's eyes didn't blink. "Because some part of you knows there's another way. I'll give you that way. Walk out, leave the device, disappear. You'll live to see the walls fall." The man's breath shuddered. His finger hovered over the trigger. Caleb stepped closer, slow as the falling snow. "Or die now, and your cause dies with you. Choice is yours." Seconds stretched into eternity. Then, with a broken sob, the man dropped the transmitter. Caleb caught it before it hit the ground. By dawn, the children were gone, safe in the care of aid workers. The warhead was dismantled, its components scattered and erased. But the mission wasn't hailed as a victory. Official reports said nothing about children, nothing about mercy, nothing about the choice Caleb had made. All it said was that Iron Winter failed, because Caleb had disobeyed, because he hadn't detonated, because he had spared the man instead of erasing him. His team was split, half called him a savior, half a traitor. Washington buried the file, and Caleb Stroud was buried with it. Back in the present, standing in the Asheville market, the words whispered by one of the older officers reached his ears. "Iron Winter." Caleb's jaw tightened, his hand brushing against Miriam's shoulder. He had lived 30 years trying to forget that night in the snow, the weight of children's eyes on him, the ghost of the man he let walk free. But Iron Winter wasn't dead. It was waiting. And now, as Harlow's words dragged it back into the light, Caleb knew the past he had buried in the snow was finally thawing. The air on Grove Street had changed. It wasn't just the sirens fading or the crowd's murmurs quieting. It was the weight of something bigger settling over everyone, as though the town square itself realized it had been dragged into a story older and darker than its cobblestones. Director Jonathan Harlow stood in the center of the standoff, silver hair unmoving in the breeze, eyes sharp as flint. He hadn't raised his voice once, but already half the SWAT unit looked like raw recruits after their first failed drill. "Commander," Harlow said, voice low, almost conversational. "You know what you've done?" The commander shifted uncomfortably in his vest. We acted on intelligence, sir. We believed." "You didn't believe," Harlow cut in. "You assumed. You ignored your own protocols. You assaulted civilians. And worst of all," his hand gestured toward Caleb, "you zip-tied the man who wrote the protocols you swore to follow." The commander's mouth opened, then closed again. His hands, usually steady on a rifle, twitched at his sides. "Look around you," Harlow continued. "Every phone in this crowd is recording. By sundown, this footage will circle the globe. You didn't just make a tactical error. You exposed this country's most buried secret to the public." The words landed hard. Even the younger officers, who had been so quick to bark orders at Miriam, now looked sick. Caleb sat on the bench with Miriam, under the awning of Pete's Market, her blanket wrapped tight. His hand rested over hers, steady, but his gaze stayed locked on Harlow. "I told you, Harlow," Caleb said, voice calm but edged with weariness. "I walked away. 3 decades ago. I swore never again. And yet here you are," Harlow replied. Caleb's jaw tightened. "Not by choice." Miriam stirred beside him, her voice still raw from the taser. You knew this could happen. You knew the past could follow you." Caleb turned to her, his face softening. "I thought burying it would be enough." She pulled her hand away from his. "But it wasn't, was it? It never is." The words cut deeper than any rifle ever could. Harlow stepped closer, holding out the sealed envelope. "Stroud, I'm not here to drag you back into the shadows. I'm here because those shadows are already moving toward you. Whether you like it or not, Iron Winter didn't end in 87. The pieces you dismantled, he hesitated. Someone is trying to put them back together. Caleb's eyes narrowed. Impossible. I scattered them. You scattered most of them, Harlow corrected. Not all. The crowd couldn't hear every word, but they could see the intensity. The way Harlow leaned forward as though speaking to a superior, not a retired man in a dusty jacket. The way Caleb's expression didn't flinch. The officers were no longer holding rifles. They were holding their breath. The commander tried one last time to reassert himself. Sir, with respect, we cannot confirm any of this. For all we know, he's manipulating. Enough, Harlow snapped. His eyes never left Caleb, but his voice struck the commander like a hammer. You don't recognize the gravity because you weren't born into it. This man carried Iron Winter on his shoulders while the rest of us debated in warm offices. He made the call no one else could make. The commander frowned. He disobeyed orders. Harlow's head turned slowly, his glare sharp enough to cut, and saved lives. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands. Don't confuse disobedience with courage. The commander's face flushed. He looked like he wanted to argue further, but his men were already avoiding his gaze. The crowd was already shaking their heads. Authority had shifted. Miriam's hand clutched Caleb's again. They tased me, she whispered. They looked at me and saw a threat. Caleb's voice hardened. They saw fear where there was none. That's what happens when men forget what they're serving. Harlow exhaled slowly, almost like a prayer. We need you back, Stroud. The world's changing again. The kind of mistakes they made here today. His eyes flicked toward the commander, then back. They'll be repeated on a larger stage. Unless someone who remembers the cost reminds them how to stop. Caleb looked down at the envelope on the bench. He didn't touch it. My loyalty belongs to her now, he said softly. Miriam blinked. For all her anger, all her fear, those words pierced through her ribs and left her silent. Harlow's jaw flexed, but he nodded. Then keep it. But the offer stands. He turned, his voice sharp as he faced the SWAT team. And as for the rest of you, learn from today. You didn't just stumble into the wrong street. You stumbled into history. You're lucky to be walking away at all. The unit dispersed slowly, weapons lowered, faces pale. The commander barked half-hearted orders, but no one moved with the same sharpness as before. They had been broken not by violence, not by blood, but by gravity. The kind of gravity only a man like Caleb Stroud carried. The crowd lingered, whispering. Some bowed their heads as Caleb passed. A few even murmured, "Sir," under their breath without knowing why. Miriam leaned into Caleb's arm, her body trembling. You can't hide it anymore, she whispered. I don't want to, Caleb answered quietly, but I won't live it again. The envelope remained unopened on the shelf of their home, beside a jar of spare keys and a cracked oil can. Weeks later, it still gathered dust. Caleb never so much as glanced at it. But the silence that followed was different now. It wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence before something returns. 3 weeks passed. The bruises on Miriam's chest had faded, but not the memory of falling. Some nights she still woke with a gasp, hand clutching her collarbone as though the taser barbs were still lodged there. Caleb would stir beside her, lay a hand over hers, and whisper, You're safe now. But safety was a fragile word. The town of Asheville had changed since the incident. Patrol cars no longer drove past the Stroud home with suspicion. Now, they slowed out of something else, deference, unease, a kind of respect laced with fear. Officers who once waved perfunctorily now lowered their eyes when Caleb appeared. At the diner, people whispered when he entered. Some nodded stiffly, others avoided him entirely, as though afraid that proximity to Caleb Stroud might pull them into some story too heavy for ordinary men. For Miriam, the hardest part was the silence. Her husband had always been a quiet man, but his silence used to feel like steadiness, like a harbor against storms. Now it felt different. Heavy, concealing, like behind every pause lay a truth too sharp to touch. One morning, while folding laundry in their kitchen, she asked him the question she had been carrying like a stone in her throat. Who are you really, Caleb? He looked up from the clock gear he was adjusting at the table. His eyes, those gray eyes that had stopped a squad of armed men with 5 words, didn't waver. I'm your husband, he said. Her lips pressed thin. That's not what they saw at the market. That's not what Director Harlow saluted. They saw someone else. Someone I don't know. Caleb set down the gear carefully, aligning it on the rag as though precision could buy him time. You know more of me than anyone ever has, Mary. You know the man who fixes things, who wakes with you every morning, that's the truth. But it's not the whole truth, she whispered. His silence answered for him. At the veterans' shelter the next day, Caleb worked on a wheelchair with his usual quiet focus. The younger vets watched him differently now, some with awe, some with suspicion. A Marine with a scar running down his cheek finally spoke up. Is it true that you were Obsidian? That you ran Iron Winter? Caleb didn't look up from the axle he was tightening. What do you think? The Marine shifted uncomfortably. I think if it is true, then you've been carrying something the rest of us can't even imagine. Caleb tightened the last bolt, tested the wheels, and only then answered. Everyone carries something, mine just has a name. The room went quiet. At home, the envelope from Harlow still sat unopened on the shelf. Miriam dusted around it each week but never touched it. She told herself it was because she respected Caleb's choice. But in truth, she feared what it contained. One night she asked, "Why don't you just open it?" "Because some things aren't meant to be read," Caleb said. She stared at him, searching his face. "Or because you're afraid it'll pull you back." He didn't answer. The town's whispers grew bolder. In the diner, a reporter from Raleigh approached him, notebook in hand. "Mr. Stroud," she asked, "why didn't you accept reinstatement? If what they say is true, you could still—" Caleb cut her off with a look so sharp she faltered mid-sentence. "Because the world doesn't need me to come back," he said. "It needs to learn not to make the same mistakes again." The reporter's pen hovered, then scratched frantically. But the truth was heavier than Caleb admitted aloud. At night, when Miriam had fallen asleep, he sat on the porch in the dark, hands folded, listening to the cicadas. His mind drifted back to the snow in Krakow, the children's faces, the man with the dead man's switch. He had let that man live. And now, whispers in his old channels suggested that man, or what was left of him, might not have disappeared as completely as Caleb had once hoped. One evening, Miriam joined him on the porch. She carried 2 cups of tea, set one beside him, and wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "They filmed you," she said softly. "I know. Half the world's seen you by now. I know. They'll come looking." Caleb turned his head, eyes meeting hers in the dim porch light. "They always do." Her hands trembled slightly as she held her cup. "What happens when they do, Caleb? When the shadows come back?" He exhaled slowly, his face unreadable. "Then I'll do what I've always done, fix what's broken." Her voice broke, raw. "And if what's broken this time is us?" That silence cut deeper than any blade. For the first time in years, Miriam began locking the bedroom door at night. She told herself it was habit, nothing more. But in her heart, she wasn't sure if she was keeping others out or keeping her husband's past from seeping further in. And Caleb, sitting alone in the garage, tools laid out neatly before him, whispered into the empty air, "I tried, Mary. God knows I tried." The story should have ended on Grove Street. A mistake corrected, apologies offered. Caleb Stroud returning to his quiet life of fixing lawnmowers and fetching coffee for Miriam. That's what he told himself. That's what Miriam desperately prayed for. But secrets don't stay buried when cameras are rolling. The video spread online in less than 24 hours. Grainy cell phone footage, shaky hands, muffled gasps, but the image was clear enough. An elderly man in a brown jacket, wrists zip-tied. His wife collapsed on the pavement. And then 5 words spoken calmly, words that stopped an entire SWAT team in their tracks. "Call Director Harlow right now." The clip ended with Harlow himself saluting the man, the crowd gasping, and the officer who had fired the taser stripping off his vest in shame. It went viral. Not just on local feeds, not just across the country. The footage spread through Europe, Asia, places Caleb had prayed never to see his name again. At the diner, locals huddled around phones, murmuring, "Obsidian Protocol? What is that? Look at how the director saluted him. That wasn't respect. That was fear. Who the hell is Caleb Stroud?" At the shelter, younger vets whispered in awe. If it's true, if he really was Iron Winter, that changes everything. And across the ocean, in embassies and dimly lit rooms, men who had not spoken Caleb's name in decades began speaking it again. Miriam felt the shift before Caleb admitted it. She noticed how mail began arriving with no return address. Envelopes slipped beneath their door with no markings. One evening, she found him at the kitchen table, staring at a single sheet of paper. The note had no signature, no date, just 3 words typed in block letters. You left one. Miriam's hands shook as she picked it up. What does it mean? Caleb folded the paper neatly, tucked it into his jacket. Nothing. But his eyes told another story. That night, he dreamed of snow. He dreamed of the factory in Krakow, of children huddled in the cold, of the gaunt man clutching the dead man's switch. He dreamed of the man's hollow eyes when Caleb had told him to walk away. He dreamed of his words, "You'll live to see the walls fall." And then he dreamed of those walls falling and something crawling out from beneath them. By the end of the week, the first journalist arrived at their doorstep. A thin woman with glasses and a press badge that seemed too large for her. "Mr. Stroud," she said, her voice tentative, "is it true you were the architect of Obsidian Protocol? Did you run Operation Iron Winter?" Caleb stared at her, unmoving. "Go home," he said. "But sir, the people deserve to know." His voice hardened. "Go home before you start asking questions that will kill you." The reporter paled, mumbled something, and retreated. Miriam closed the door slowly, her breath trembling. "They're not going to stop, Caleb." "I know," he said. That night, Miriam finally touched the envelope from Harlow. She held it in her hands, weighing it like a bomb. "Why don't you open it?" she asked again. Caleb shook his head. "Because once it's open, there's no putting it back." Her eyes searched his face. "What if it contains the only thing keeping us safe?" His silence was answer enough. The town shifted further. Patrol cars no longer slowed in front of their home. They lingered. Not surveillance, but protection. Officers parked nearby, some under the guise of engine trouble, others under no guise at all. But protection brought attention. Neighbors whispered louder. Children pointed when Caleb walked by. The Stroud house had become less a home and more a symbol. Miriam hated it. She hated the way strangers looked at her in the grocery store. Hated the way even friends hesitated before speaking Caleb's name. Hated most of all the gnawing thought that maybe, just maybe, she never truly knew the man she married. And yet, one evening when the sunset bled red over the mountains, she found him on the porch, shoulders hunched, staring at nothing. "You're quiet," she said. "I'm remembering," he answered. "Remembering what?" His voice was flat. "What happens when you leave one man alive?" Her skin prickled cold. "You mean him?" Caleb didn't answer, but the silence was loud enough. That night, an envelope appeared under their door. Not Harlow's, not government issue. Plain paper, sealed with tape. Inside was a photograph. It showed a man older now, gaunt still, his eyes just as hollow as they had been in that factory decades ago. He stood in a marketplace half a world away, a newspaper in hand with Caleb's face on the front page. On the back of the photograph, scrawled in red ink, were 4 words. "You should have finished." Caleb stared at it for a long time. His hands didn't shake. His jaw didn't tighten. He only folded the photo in half, set it in the drawer beside Harlow's unopened envelope, and whispered to himself, "So it begins again." The first time Miriam walked into the market after the taser incident, she carried herself differently. Neighbors who once looked at her with pity now saw something steadier, sharper. The bruises along her chest were fading, but what had risen in their place was a defiance no one had seen before. She stood in line for coffee, accepted her cup from the clerk, and when he stammered an apology, she held his gaze until he looked down. Miriam had been shaken, yes. For days she had locked doors, flinched at shadows, clutched Caleb's hand in the night. But surviving humiliation in front of the whole town and surviving the silence of her husband's hidden life had lit something new in her. She was no longer just Caleb's anchor. She was becoming a wall of her own. Caleb noticed it, though he never commented. He watched as Miriam spoke sharper to the mailman who lingered too long with questions. He saw her straighten her shoulders when passing patrol cars, refusing to bow to memory. He even caught her one evening standing in front of Harlow's envelope on the shelf, her eyes narrowing as though daring it to burst open and spill its secrets. But he also knew that her strength didn't erase the danger. The photograph in the drawer haunted him, the gaunt man's hollow eyes, still alive after all these years. He had left one, and that one had returned. It wasn't just local whispers anymore. An article appeared in a European newspaper, its headline stark, "The Ghost of Obsidian Protocol, America's Unfinished War." The piece referenced the viral video, speculated about Caleb's role in Cold War missions, and most dangerously of all, published grainy images of the Obsidian badge. The article ended with a single chilling line, "If Stroud lives, so does his enemy." Caleb folded the paper neatly and slid it into the drawer with the others. Miriam watched him. "How many more will come?" she asked quietly. "As many as it takes," he said. "To kill you?" His eyes stayed on the drawer. "Or to remind me of what I should have done." The veterans at the shelter began treating him differently too. No longer just a kind old man who fixed chairs and motors. Now, when he walked in, conversations hushed. Young vets saluted instinctively, unsure why. Older ones watched with knowing eyes. One evening, a Gulf War veteran leaned close and asked, "Why didn't you take the envelope? You could have shut all this down." Caleb shook his head. "Revenge doesn't rebuild engines, and it doesn't rebuild people either." The man frowned. "But some things can't be rebuilt." Caleb looked at him, his expression unreadable. Some things shouldn't be rebuilt. At home, the air between him and Miriam shifted. Their silence was no longer just weight, it was tension stretched tight like wire. She began asking questions she had once swallowed. "Did you kill people, Caleb?" "Yes." "Did you enjoy it?" "No." "Do you regret it?" He hesitated too long. That hesitation was an answer. Still, Miriam grew stronger each day. She no longer trembled at the sight of uniforms. She no longer averted her gaze at whispers. But her resilience carried a new edge, a demand. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the porch in red light, she stood before him. "You're not the only one who has to carry this," she said. "If they come back, if this iron winter follows us here, I'm not hiding behind you." "Not again." Caleb's chest tightened. He reached for her hand, but she pulled it back. "Promise me," she said, her voice steady. "Promise me you won't keep me in the dark again." His throat worked. He wanted to promise. Wanted to give her the comfort she deserved. But promises were dangerous, and the shadows circling closer knew how to break them. That night, long after Miriam had gone to bed, Caleb sat alone in the garage. The photograph lay unfolded on the workbench. The gaunt man's eyes stared up at him. Caleb whispered into the empty air, "I should have ended you." And from outside, in the rustle of leaves and the soft crunch of gravel, it almost felt like the night whispered back, "But you didn't." The first threat wasn't a bullet. It was silence. Caleb noticed it on his morning walk. The birds that usually sang along the oak-lined street were absent. The sound of tires on gravel, the hum of porch radios gone. It was the kind of silence that didn't belong in Asheville, the kind that carried weight, as though someone was watching and holding their breath. He didn't tell Miriam. Not yet. By the end of the week, the silence broke. An email arrived on the library's public computer, unsigned, traced through half a dozen foreign servers. The librarian thought it was spam until she saw the attachment, a single photograph of Caleb and Miriam drinking coffee at the market the previous morning. No note. No demands. Just proof. "We see you." News spread beyond Asheville. A leaked memo, stamped redacted, surfaced on an underground forum. It referenced Project Obsidian and Stroud divided by Operation Iron Winter. Analysts speculated in half-truths, weaving Caleb into conspiracies ranging from black site prisons to engineered plagues. Most of it was fiction. But buried in the noise was enough fact to be dangerous. And far away in Warsaw, in Moscow, in places where men who remembered the Cold War still sat at long oak tables, the name Caleb Stroud was spoken again. Not with respect, with calculation. Miriam felt it too. She walked to the market one afternoon and caught a man watching her from across the street. He wasn't local, his shoes were too polished, his posture too rigid. He turned away when she noticed, but his reflection lingered in every glass pane she passed afterward. That evening, she slammed the door harder than she meant to. Caleb looked up from the garage. "They're watching us," she snapped. "I know." Her chest tightened. "You know? And you just sit there fixing engines?" Caleb wiped his hands on a rag, his expression unreadable. "Engines aren't the only thing I'm fixing." Miriam's eyes burned. "Then fix this, Caleb. Fix us before we drown in your ghosts." At the diner, whispers grew bolder. I heard the Russians are sniffing around. No, it's the Chinese. Obsidian wasn't just ours, you know. Hell, maybe it's both. Whoever finds him first wins the next war. Caleb heard every word but didn't respond. He ate his pie, paid his bill, and walked out with the same calm that had unnerved armed men weeks before. But inside, the storm churned. That night, another letter appeared under their door. This one was handwritten, the ink blotched, the strokes jagged. The world thinks you ended Iron Winter. We know better. One piece remains. And so do we. There was no signature. Only a symbol scratched at the bottom. A circle split by a single black line. Miriam stared at it, trembling. What does it mean? Caleb's jaw clenched. It means the man I let live has friends. He knew what was coming before the news confirmed it. 2 days later, an explosion tore through a storage facility in Eastern Europe. Official reports called it an accident. But grainy footage showed the same symbol circle with a line spray-painted on the wall. Caleb sat on the porch that night, the newspaper folded in his lap. Miriam joined him, her hands gripping a blanket around her shoulders. You can't pretend anymore, she said quietly. They're not done with you. Caleb stared into the darkness, voice low. No, they never were. And so the silence ended. In its place came the first true move. A foreign assassin arriving in Asheville under a borrowed name, slipping into the country with forged papers. He didn't come for Caleb first. He came for Miriam. The man came quietly, like all professionals did. He rented a room above the hardware store, paid in cash, asked no questions. His cover was tight enough and academic on sabbatical research. But Caleb saw him the first morning he appeared in town. The shoes were too new, the eyes too old. For 3 days, Caleb said nothing to Miriam. He watched the man shadow them at the diner, at the shelter, even once at church, sitting 2 pews behind with a Bible held upside down. Caleb's silence wasn't cowardice, it was calculation. He wanted to see who the man was here for. On the 4th day, he had his answer. It was late afternoon when Miriam walked home from the market, a paper bag tucked under her arm. She didn't notice the car idling too long at the corner or the figure leaning just inside the alley. But Caleb, tightening bolts on a porch railing, noticed everything. The assassin stepped forward, slow, measured, pretending to adjust his jacket. His hand dipped toward his side. "Miri," Caleb called softly. She turned just as the man slipped from the alley. The world slowed. His hand flashed inside his coat, and Caleb moved. He wasn't fast anymore. 73 years dulled reflexes, bent backs, stiffened knees. But he didn't need speed. He had timing. As the man's hand emerged with a blade silent, subtle, meant to spill blood without a sound, Caleb's voice cracked the air like a gunshot. "Stop." The assassin froze. His body didn't want to, but his mind did. Because in that voice, calm as steel, he heard something primal. "You know who I am," Caleb said evenly. The man's eyes flickered. He did know. Neighbors froze on porches. Children stopped mid-step. Miriam's bag of groceries split open, apples tumbling across the sidewalk. She clutched her chest, staring at the man 3 feet away with the knife trembling in his grip. Caleb stepped forward, slow, unthreatening. "You're not here for me," he said. "You're here to make me suffer. To take her." The assassin's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. Caleb's eyes never blinked. "You were sent by the one I left alive." The silence said it all. The street was a stage now, and every neighbor was the audience. Phones raised, breaths caught. Caleb lowered his voice to a whisper only the assassin could hear. "Tell him this," he said. "Tell him I still remember the snow. Tell him I still remember his hand on that switch. And tell him, next time I won't let him walk away." The knife slipped slightly in the man's grip. His breath stuttered. He stepped back once, twice, then turned and vanished down the alley. The crowd erupted shouts, questions, half-panicked laughter. Miriam collapsed onto the porch steps, her breath ragged. Later, when the police arrived, they took statements. Descriptions. Promises to patrol the neighborhood more closely. But Caleb knew it wouldn't matter. The man wasn't local law's problem. He was a message. Miriam sat at the table that night, her hands still trembling as she sipped tea. "You didn't even touch him," she said. I didn't need to. Her eyes met his, filled with both terror and awe. What did you say? Caleb's voice was quiet, only what he needed to hear. But long after Miriam had gone to bed, Caleb sat in the dark garage with the photograph of the gaunt man. His mind drifted back not to Asheville, not to Harlow, not to Miriam. Back to 1987. Back to the factory in Krakow. Because what the world never knew, what Harlow never knew, what even Miriam didn't know, was this. Iron Winter hadn't just been a battle against the enemy. It had been a battle against themselves. That night in the snow, after Caleb spared the man with the dead man's switch, not everyone in his unit had agreed. One of them, a man he trusted, had turned on him. You disobeyed, the man hissed in the shadows of the factory. You endangered the mission. Caleb remembered the betrayal in his comrade's eyes, the knife glinting, the mutiny nearly sparking right there amidst the children's cries. He had won the argument then. The unit had followed his call, but the betrayal had never left him. And now, decades later, with assassins slipping into Asheville and threats scrawled in red ink, Caleb began to wonder, had the man he spared been the true danger? Or had the danger always been inside his own unit? The knock came at midnight. It wasn't loud, just 3 measured taps against the door, like a man who already knew it would be opened. Caleb rose silently from his chair in the garage, his knees aching but steady. Miriam stirred in bed upstairs, but he whispered through the dark, "Stay." He opened the door. 2 men stood there. The first was gaunt, older now, but unmistakable, the hollow-eyed figure from Krakow, the one Caleb had spared beneath the snow. His hair had gone white, his coat too thin for the autumn chill, but his eyes burned with the same fanatic glint as decades earlier. The second man made Caleb's stomach knot, because he recognized him too. Note, an enemy. Note, foreign, a former brother in arms. The very man who had turned on him in the factory, blade drawn in the dark, screaming that Caleb had betrayed the mission. He hadn't died in Iron Winter. He hadn't disappeared. He had defected. And now he stood beside the enemy Caleb had let live. Caleb Stroud, the gaunt man rasped, voice cracking like frozen glass. 30 years you stole from me. 30 years I lived in shadow while you lived in peace. Caleb's face didn't move. Peace? He shook his head faintly. You call this peace? The defector stepped forward, his smirk thin and cruel. You thought you buried us. You thought you buried me, but you only buried yourself. Tonight, it ends. Caleb exhaled slowly. His voice never rose. No. Tonight, it begins again. Miriam appeared at the top of the stairs despite his warning. She wore her shawl, her face pale but her spine rigid. You don't belong here, she said, her voice trembling but strong. The gaunt man's eyes flicked to her, hatred sharp. She's the reason you're weak, he hissed at Caleb. You left me alive for her. You chose love over duty. Caleb's jaw tightened. No. I chose humanity over monsters. The defector laughed bitterly. Humanity? There's no humanity in war. You should have learned that in Krakow. Caleb's gaze was ice. And you should have learned that betrayal leaves deeper scars than any enemy. The silence stretched. Neighbors stirred on porches. Somewhere, a phone camera blinked red. The world was watching again. The gaunt man raised a trembling hand, fingers hovering over the pistol in his coat. You'll watch her fall like I watched my comrades fall. And then you'll understand what it means to leave one alive. Miriam gasped. Caleb stepped forward, his voice cutting through the night like steel. You won't. The man's hand froze. Because Caleb wasn't pleading, he wasn't begging, he was commanding. You've lived 30 years on borrowed time, Caleb continued, each word measured. Not because you deserved it, because I gave it to you, and now you know the truth. Mercy is a debt, and debt always comes due. The gaunt man's hands shook violently. The pistol slipped from his grip, clattering to the porch. His breath came in ragged sobs. His fanatic fire guttered into ash. But the defector wasn't so easily broken. He stepped forward, his own weapon raised. Always the words, Stroud, always the calm voice. You think words win wars? Let's see how far they carry you now. Caleb didn't move. He simply looked into the man's eyes, the eyes of someone who had once been a brother, who had once shared rations in the snow, who had once sworn the same oath. And he said, very softly, 5 words. You already lost back then. The defector's face cracked. Rage surged. His hands trembled. The pistol wavered, then dropped to his side, because deep down he knew it was true. By dawn, both men were gone, taken by federal agents who arrived in black vans, no sirens, no words. The neighbors whispered for days about the sight, but no one dared interfere. Caleb sat on the porch steps, Miriam beside him, the sunrise bleeding gold over the mountains. She leaned into him, her voice quiet. What did you do to them? He squeezed her hand gently. Only what they needed to hear. Weeks later, the unopened envelope from Harlow still sat on the shelf. Dust gathered on its edges. Miriam sometimes stared at it, but Caleb never touched it, because the choice had already been made. He would not return. He would not reopen Obsidian. He would fix engines. He would mend wheelchairs. He would walk with Miriam to the market and buy her coffee. And yet patrol cars slowed in front of his house, not in suspicion but in respect. Veterans nodded when he passed, whispers trailing behind him. Children looked at him the way children looked at mountains, silent, immovable, enduring. One evening, a reporter caught him outside the VFW. Mr. Stroud, she asked, notebook trembling. Why just 5 words? Why did they listen? Caleb looked at her with eyes that had seen both snow and silence, betrayal and mercy. Because some words don't shout, he said, they land. He turned, handed Miriam's, and walked into the fading light.